Is that on to its fullest?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Oh, thanks.
Thank you for welcoming me back once again. It's been nice to be with you here this 3 weeks while your regular minister is taking some time off. I'm Kevin Carson, for those who don't know me yet. Are there any announcements this morning? Well, before we get started, I want to tell you that after all that transpired in the last week, I felt the need to change my sermon topic today to speak to what is going on in America right now. Making our Unitarian Universalist faith deeper green was the original topic and is a subject near and dear to my heart. So perhaps at a later date I can return and you can hear the sermon I had originally planned. So we'll now begin our worship. Our call to celebration this morning is the poem I Too Sing America by Langston Hughes. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. Please join now in our opening hymn, number 170, We Are a Gentle, Angry People.
So I'm lighting this chalice in honor of the many people that marched yesterday, who marched for love, and who are fighting the terrible audacities that have occurred in the last few weeks in our country. And I was just so inspired. And I was inspired because of the love that was shown, but also because I was part of the movement in 1965 and walked with Martin Luther King in Boston and was on Boston Common with him to fight civil rights. And that was a significant time in my life, and it's the only other time I can compare to what has happened now in our country. So I hope that we all keep everyone in our prayers and continue to show the love we have. And with that in mind, I'd like to read from Thomas More. This is from a book entitled Original Self. Brief reading. Naivety is the failure to grow up and enter adult life. Americans are naive in many ways, sometimes identifying with noble values while acting out in outrageously self-serving and violent ways. We seem to believe in our naive values and fail to see the defining contradiction of our culture. Our noble ideals joined to the atrocious ways we often treat ourselves and the people of the world. Our naivety blinds us to our actual values and to the disasters we inflict.
Please join now in our unison affirmation as printed in your order of service. Love is the doctrine of this church, the quest for truth its sacrament, and service its prayer, to dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve human need, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other and with God. My reading this morning is an excerpt from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech titled "The Quest for Peace and Justice," which was delivered in Oslo, Norway in December 1964 on the acceptance of the Nobel Prize for Peace. All that I have said boils down to the point of affirming that mankind's survival is dependent upon man's ability to solve problems of racial injustice, poverty, and war. The solution of these problems is in turn dependent upon man squaring his moral compass with his scientific progress and learning the practical art of living in harmony. Some years ago, a famous novelist died. Among his papers was found a list of suggested story plots for future stories, the most prominently underscored being this one. A widely separated family inherits a house in which they have to live together. This is the great new problem of mankind. We have inherited a big house, a great world house, in which we have to live together. Black and white, Easterners and Westerners, Gentiles and Jews, Catholics and Protestants, Muslims and Hindu, a family unduly separate in ideas, culture, and interests, who, because we can never again live without each other, must learn somehow in this one big world to live with each other. I have the personal faith that mankind will somehow rise up to the occasion and give new directions to an age drifting rapidly to its doom. In spite of the tensions and uncertainties of this period, something profoundly meaningful is taking place. Old systems of exploitation and oppression are passing away, and out of the womb of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. Doors of opportunity are gradually being opened to those at the bottom of society. The shirtless and barefoot people of the land are developing a new sense of somebodiness and carving a tunnel of hope through the dark mountain of despair. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. Here and there, an individual or group dares to love and rises to the majestic heights of moral maturity. So in a real sense, this is a great time to be alive. Therefore, I'm not yet discouraged about the future. Granted that the easygoing optimism of yesterday is impossible. Granted that those who pioneer in the struggle for peace and freedom will still be battered by the storms of persecution, leading them to the nagging feeling that they can no longer bear such a heavy burden, and the temptation of wanting to retreat to a more quiet and serene life. Granted that we face a world crisis which leaves us standing so often amid the surging murmur of life's restless sea. But every crisis has both its dangers and its opportunities. It can spell either salvation or doom. In a dark, confused world, the kingdom of God may yet reign in the hearts of men. I invite you now to share in the joys and sorrows of this community.
Good morning. Unfortunately, I couldn't make the march or the presentation yesterday because I was out, as I do once a month, cleaning up one of my local beaches, cleaning up the plastic that washes up from the ocean. But I do remember back in 1965 when I was a student at Northeastern, and I participated in the march down to the Boston Common, and I heard Dr. Martin Luther King speak at the bandstand. Unfortunately, I couldn't see him because he was so surrounded by his entourage. He was well protected, at least then, but I could hear him, and it was quite an impressive moment.
Good morning, I'm Lissa Anderson, and I just wanted to thank particularly this group of Summer Sunday service goers for your welcoming of my grandson, who's been here a number of times so far this summer, and this is his place. Thank you.
Well, let us hold these joys and sorrows in our hearts, as well as all of those who remain unspoken. Amen. Please join me now in a time of spoken prayer and meditation, followed by a silent reflection. We will end our silence by singing hymn number 123, Spirit of Life. Let us pray. Spirit of life and love, sacred mystery at the heart of being. We are a nation divided. Many of us are grieving, and we fear what the future may bring. There has been so much hate, so many reasons to be worried for our neighbors and the world. Let us bind the wounds and heal our nation. But even as we take comfort in knowing that love will triumph, let us not become complacent. Let us hold fast to the good and stand always on the side of love. Let us bear witness as a people of faith. Let us stand with those who are oppressed and afraid, letting them know that we are their ally. Let us work to build a more just, equitable, and compassionate world for everyone. Let us be a voice for all life, the animals and the plants, who are our companions in the interdependent web of all existence. A voice for the earth. And let us always recognize the holy in the hearts of others, even if they are not ready to recognize the holy in us. Amen. In my ministry to date, I have preached over 120 sermons, and only twice have I decided to change the message of the sermon in response to current events. The first time was last November, the Sunday after the elections, and today is the second. There are simply times when our values are so threatened that I feel compelled to speak from a place of prophetic witness about what is going on, and also from a place of pastoral concern about the anger, fear, and anxiety that all of us are feeling. Back in November, the anxiety among liberal people of faith following the election of Donald Trump was profound. It was hard to comprehend that the electoral process had allowed someone who ran a campaign filled with blatant racist and xenophobic rhetoric to become president. Someone who seemed to be against almost every principle and value we affirm in our faith, against even the fundamental values of American society. 9 months later, it is still difficult to accept, and the scandals and the inept leadership in the daily news are exhausting to follow. Many people were afraid then and still are. A number of LGBT folks in the churches I regularly serve spoke to me about their real fears that hard-won rights would soon be lost. Others despaired that the small progress we had made on environmental issues would be reversed by a president who denied the reality of climate change and campaigned on the promise of increasing the production of fossil fuels and especially coal. And as many of us began to confront white supremacy and support the work of movements like Black Lives Matter, we knew it could only get worse with an administration who liked to use the coded language of white nationalism in his rallies, and sometimes even encouraged violence against protesters and the press. Someone who welcomed advisors with close ties to the alt-right. Some of my colleagues began to speculate about whether we were experiencing a time like the rise of Hitler in Germany in the 1920s and 30s, whether we would be called to become the new confessing church that stood against fascism. Would our ministries become more like that of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who ultimately gave his life for his opposition to the Nazis? At the time, I felt it was not yet as bad as that. And I still believe this to be the case. I believe America today is too large and too diverse a nation for an extreme ideology like fascism to ever gain much traction. But it is impossible not to see the parallels when torch-bearing mobs are chanting Nazi slogans and giving Nazi salutes. When our president then suggests there are some fine people among their ranks and somehow sees a moral equivalency between their hatred and bigotry and the values of those who showed up to oppose them, it reveals that such fringe ideas can influence those in power in ways that can cause real harm nonetheless. The President of the United States appears to be sympathetic to the cause of people like the terrorist who killed a young American woman last weekend by driving a car into a crowd of counter-protesters. It is a moral outrage, and we must remain vigilant. It has now been 53 years since Dr. King accepted the Nobel Peace Prize. And I wish I could say that we are living up to his aspirations, that in our dark, confused world, the kingdom of God, or what we might call the beloved community, now reigns in the hearts of men and women. But this is, of course, not the case. In our own nation, racism is still an ugly reality that a new generation are forced to confront. It is remarkable that more than 50 years after Selma, there are blatant examples of politicians working to deny the voting rights of African Americans and other minorities, or at least make it more difficult for them to vote. It is distressing that saying Black Lives Matter is seen as controversial, and it is even more distressing that it even needs to be said. Too many young black men are dying due to violence and in tragic encounters with law enforcement still. Though we have made some progress, there is clear evidence that racism is still an endemic problem in our legal system. It is easy to point to the hateful rhetoric of white supremacists and call out the overt racism, but let us not forget the systemic racism and oppression of wealth and income inequality, unequal access to health care and education, and more subtle expressions. Those of us born with white privilege too easily ignore the systems of oppression that benefit us by mere accident of birth. In the larger world, we still face the threat of war and nuclear annihilation as nations rattle sabers and threaten one another. It was only a few days ago, if you recall, that the pundits on the news were openly discussing whether or not our president was threatening North Korea with nuclear war. I could not believe what I was hearing. Seemingly rational people discussing nuclear war as if it were a real possibility. There is so much pain and suffering in our world, so much darkness and strife, that it can be hard to see anything but a dark mountain of despair. At times, the great world house that Dr. King described seems like one big dysfunctional family that is hell-bent on self-destruction. More like a house shared by roommates who absolutely hate each other. In our despair, we struggle to understand why the human family is so fractured. It is tempting to embrace a kind of Calvinist theology that human beings are hopelessly depraved and sinful and capable of changing for the better, looking perhaps for divine justice in the next life if justice is denied in this one. Or perhaps we should retreat into a status quo consumerism, accepting that the planet might simply be better off without us, awaiting our species' inevitable and well-earned demise. In a word, we could give up hope. As Unitarian Universalists, it can be hard to affirm our principle of a world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. In the face of human cruelty and indifference, these words can sound like a utopian dream that can never be realized, or a naive platitude designed to make ourselves feel better. What do we even mean by world community when there are clearly so many issues that divide the human family? So much hatred and distrust. And even if it is possible to achieve our vision of a world community, how do we balance promoting our ideals and values with accepting the different values of others? Is it fair for us to assume that everyone even wants the kind of peace and liberty we propose? And if not, should they? But we do not give up hope. Nor does our faith let us sit idly by with the expectation that divine justice will be meted out someday, somehow. We are called to act, to do something about the injustice in the world and work for the goal of world community, where every member of the human family enjoys a life of peace, the liberties we enjoy, and the expectation of justice. When we remain committed to our faith and principles, we can start to see Dr. King's tunnel of hope through the dark mountain of despair. This is not some naive optimism rooted in wishful thinking. It is hope rooted in a deep faith in human dignity and love. We are a people of hope. We are a glass half full faith that acknowledges the many problems in our world, but at the same time recognizes the inherent worth in every person and the tremendous capacity for people of goodwill to change the world for the better. It was hope that sustained us when we marched with Dr. King in Selma, and when we marched in recent years for voting rights in North Carolina, and when we marched in support of women's rights and on action on climate change. It was hope that sustained us when we stood on the side of love and fought for so many years for marriage equality and the rights of LGBTQ folks. It was hope that brought out so many Unitarian Universalists among the tens of thousands who marched against racism and bigotry in Boston yesterday. Our hope extends to so many issues. Our faith is a beacon of hope for anyone who wants to join us in worship and search for truth and meaning, no matter who they are or what they believe. When we see injustice and suffering, we act, and we look to our communities of faith to sustain us in this often difficult and demanding work. As my colleague Tom Shade says, our liberal religious communities are there to contain both our comforts and our discontents. They empower us to make a holy discontent effective in the world and yet bearable for a lifetime. And despite what you may hear from politicians or read on Facebook, there is good reason for hope. Within our own lifetimes, just think of the incredible change we have seen in the world. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. The end of apartheid in South Africa. Dramatic shifts in race relations, gender roles, and marriage equality becoming the law of the land. I vividly remember watching the news in amazement back in November 1989, when crowds of East and West Germans gathered at the Berlin Wall. In what seemed like an instant, everything changed. The East German police refused to enforce the old policies. They would no longer shoot those crossing into the West. And they walked away from their posts. The people began to cross over from both sides, and they began destroying the wall with whatever hand tools they could find, a wall that had separated them for almost 30 years. Over the next few weeks, large machinery was brought in and the wall was dismantled. It was a watershed moment of transformation. And we have witnessed other watershed moments that seemed almost impossible to imagine only a few decades ago. Real change is possible. It happens. There is reason for hope. Sure, there is still plenty of work yet to do. The kingdom is not yet realized, but we must never let despair get the upper hand. As Dr. King said, every crisis has both its dangers and its opportunities. It can spell either salvation or doom. To further our vision of a world community, we must look for such opportunities in moments like the one that brought down the Berlin Wall. They are out there, but we, the human family, must decide to act. I am starting to believe that such a watershed moment is at hand for Americans to seriously confront systemic racism and intolerance. Wouldn't it be ironic if the outrageous, unpresidential behavior we have witnessed lately were to result in real awakening and positive change? Around the world, we're seeing a rapid growth of grassroots organizations responding to the many crises we face. On the issue of climate change, for example, if you read any of the recent books by authors such as David Korten, Naomi Klein, or Paul Hawken, you will see what they describe as a movement of movements arising. It is not just affluent, well-educated Westerners anymore leading the way. Many of these groups are emerging from within historically marginalized communities, and significantly, many are founded and led by women. Religion and spiritual beliefs are also frequently cited as a motivating factor. There is what Paul Hawken calls blessed unrest at work in the world, as people of all faith traditions, including the spiritual but not religious, have begun to feel their values threatened and feel an urgent need to do something. At the same time, greater access to the internet has been especially beneficial in connecting like-minded people from all walks of life and facilitating action. The phenomenon during the Arab Spring uprisings resulted in the overthrow of governments, including dictators who seem to hold all the power. It is exciting to imagine the possibilities. There is reason for hope. But as we do the work of building the world community, we must be mindful of diversity and not make the assumption that we have all the answers the world needs. Just because we share a common house, it does not mean we share common goals or ideals. Dr. King acknowledged the reality of the diverse beliefs and cultures that are both a source of great strength and a source of great divisiveness in the human family. This is something we need to take to heart. Because we can never again live without each other, we must learn somehow in this one big world to live with each other. There is no real alternative if the human families just thrive. We religious liberals have powerful ideas about human rights and a democratic society, and we should share these with the world. But we can also learn from other cultures. The human family is filled with different perspectives and sincere differences of opinion. To be true to our own principles, we must recognize that everyone has a right to the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, even if we strongly disagree with the truths that others find along the way. Community does not mean an end to diversity, but an acceptance and embrace of diversity. But this does not mean we must condone hate speech or ideologies that are at odds with our principles. We are indeed a human family. But as we know, human families can have conflicts that are demeaning and demanding, and they can take a very long time to resolve. Some human conflicts span generations and even centuries. It can be overwhelming. This is a good reason for belonging to a faith community like this one, a place that nurtures the spirit and recharges the hope we need to sustain us. When I'm feeling overwhelmed, I like to read a saying from the Talmud that I have saved on the desktop of my computer. It says, "Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now, love mercy now, walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it." Making the great world house into a home filled with love and respect, a world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, as we affirm in our 7 principles, is a daunting task. But it is the work we are called to do. To paraphrase a famous saying of St. Teresa of Avila, our faith has no body but yours, no hands, no feet on this earth but yours. Yours are the eyes through which compassion looks on this world. Yours are the feet which walk to do good. Yours are the hands through which all the world is blessed. May it be so. An offering to support the work of this church will now be given and gratefully received. Before my words for sending forth, I want to say as your guest minister how grateful I've been for the musicianship that I've experienced here. The summertime is often a challenge to find musicians, and I've been very fortunate that the music has been such high quality and so fantastic. Thank you very much. If you've been following the news about Charlottesville, and I suspect you have, you've probably seen interviews with Dr. Cornel West, who has been very involved with a group of clergy who showed up for the initial response last weekend. I want to leave you this morning with another quote from an older interview that Cornel West gave a few years ago. And please note that the transcript was written in the vernacular of his speaking voice, so I'm going to read it the way it says. Optimism and hope are different. Optimism tends to be based on the notion that there is enough evidence to say, looks pretty good out there, things gonna be better. Much more rational, deeply secular. Whereas hope looks at the evidence and says, it don't look good at all. But we're gonna take a leap of faith. Go beyond the evidence to create new possibilities based on visions that become contagious, to allow people to engage in heroic action, always against the odds, no guarantee whatsoever. That's hope. I'm a prisoner of hope. I'm gonna die a prisoner of hope. Never gonna believe that misery and despair gonna have the last word. Our closing hymn is number 168, One More Step, number 168. light of hope from this place into the world, doing justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly with the sacred mystery that sustains us. Go in peace, return in love. Amen.
Thank you.